There are nights that mark a pilot's life forever, and mine came on a Tuesday in March, flying over the vast darkness of the Gulf Coast with 180 souls, trusting my ability to bring them safely to their final destination. My name is Thompson. I'm 42 years old with 23 years in commercial aviation. I've accumulated over 15,000 flight hours, crossed oceans, battled storms, and landed at some of the world's most challenging airports. I thought I'd seen it all until that night over the Louisiana wetlands, when I discovered that Mother Nature still had surprises capable of testing every limit of my experience. American Airlines Flight 3847 departed Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport at 9:30 p.m., bound for Miami International Airport. It was a route I knew like the back of my hand, having flown that corridor dozens of times over the years. The Airbus A320 was in perfect condition, the crew was experienced, and the weather briefing showed only scattered clouds over the Gulf Coast region, nothing that could pose any kind of concern. Beside me in the cockpit was First Officer Mike Rodriguez, a sharp 28-year-old I'd flown with on several occasions. Mike was meticulous, technically flawless, and had that hunger for knowledge characteristic of pilots who truly love the profession. Completing our crew, we had 4 flight attendants, led by Purser Sarah Williams, a professional with 15 years of experience who knew every emergency procedure like clockwork. The first 100 minutes of flight passed absolutely normally. We departed DFW under clear skies, climbed to our cruise level of 37,000 feet, and followed the established airway heading southeast. The passengers were relaxed, many already sleeping after the dinner service, others watching movies on the entertainment system or reading. It was exactly the kind of routine flight every commercial pilot performs hundreds of times throughout their career. The first indication something was wrong came through the weather radar as we began approaching the Louisiana Gulf Coast region. Mike spotted it first, pointing to the screen where the characteristic red and yellow patches indicating intense convective activity were starting to appear. "Captain, you seeing this?" Mike adjusted the radar range to a larger scale. "Looks like there's a cell developing right in front of us." I leaned in to analyze the screen more closely. There was indeed significant convective formation developing directly on our route, but what caught my attention most was how fast it was growing. Within minutes, that small yellow patch had transformed into a red and magenta mass extending for dozens of nautical miles. "This wasn't in the weather forecast," I muttered, double-checking the briefing documents. "Let's request a deviation from control." I grabbed the mic and contacted Houston Center. Houston Center, American 3847, requesting left deviation due convective activity ahead. The response came almost immediately. American 3847, Houston Center, approved left deviation up to 15 nautical miles. Maintain FL 370. Approved left deviation up to 15 miles, maintaining FL 370, American 3847. I initiated a gentle left turn, steering the aircraft away from the storm that continued growing on radar. For a few minutes it seemed we'd found a clear route, but it soon became evident we were dealing with something much larger than a simple, isolated convective cell. "Captain," Mike's voice carried growing concern, "look at the radar now." What I saw on the screen made me swallow hard. The storm had expanded dramatically, transforming into a massive weather system, extending over 200 nautical miles in all directions. The radar colors now showed intensities I'd rarely seen, with areas of intense magenta indicating extreme convective activity, hail, and severe turbulence. "Houston Center, American 3847, we need a greater deviation. The convective formation has expanded significantly." American 3847, Houston Center, unfortunately we don't have airspace available for greater deviation due traffic. Maintain present heading and report conditions. It was exactly the response I didn't want to hear. I looked at Mike, who shared my concern. We were flying toward one of the most intense storms I'd ever encountered, with limited deviation options, and 180 passengers trusting our ability to navigate this situation safely. "Mike, let's reduce to turbulence penetration speed and secure the cabin. Looks like we're going to have to punch through this thing." I reduced engine power and adjusted speed to 280 knots, the recommended speed for traversing turbulent areas. Simultaneously, I turned on the seatbelt sign and picked up the PA to address the passengers. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're encountering some turbulence ahead, and I'm asking everyone to return to their seats and keep those seatbelts fastened tight. The flight attendants should also prepare for turbulence. Thanks for your cooperation. Sarah, the purser, appeared at the cockpit door seconds later. Captain, passengers are secure. What's the situation? We've got one hell of a storm ahead, Sarah. Could get pretty bumpy for the next 20 or 30 minutes. Keep everything buttoned up back there. Copy that, Captain. We're ready. She left to supervise the cabin, and Mike and I focused on preparations for entering the storm. I increased cockpit lighting, verified all instruments were functioning properly, and mentally reviewed procedures for flight in adverse weather conditions. The first indication of the intensity of what lay ahead was the change in sky color in front of us. Even on this moonless night, you could distinguish the dark, threatening mass of cumulonimbus clouds rising like mountains on the horizon. Occasionally, flashes of electrical activity illuminated the cloud's interior, revealing the violent activity happening inside. Radar to max range, I instructed Mike. Let's try to identify the heaviest cores to avoid them. Captain, I'm seeing cells with red and magenta intensity scattered throughout the entire area. Not much room to maneuver. He was right. The radar showed a maze of intense convective activity, with few areas of lesser intensity we could use as corridors. It was like trying to navigate through a meteorological minefield. Let's head for that yellow area there. I pointed to a region of lower intensity approximately 15 degrees right of our current route. Houston Center, American 3847, requesting heading 050 due weather deviation. American 3847, Houston Center, approved heading 052. I initiated a right turn, directing the aircraft toward what seemed our best option. But even before completing the turn, it became clear conditions were changing rapidly. What had been a lower intensity area on radar now showed more intense colors, and turbulence began before we officially entered the cloud. The first jolt was moderate, making the aircraft rock gently. I adjusted my grip on the controls and checked that Mike was ready. The second was more intense, a slam that made the plane shudder and drew some worried groans from the passenger cabin. Ready, Mike? Ready, Captain. And then we entered the storm. The first thing I noticed was the rain, not the ordinary rain we occasionally encounter in flight, but a liquid curtain so dense it instantly reduced visibility to zero. The windscreen became completely covered with a sheet of water the wipers could barely clear, and the sound of precipitation hammering the fuselage was deafening. Turbulence came in successive waves, each more intense than the last. The aircraft climbed and dropped hundreds of feet in seconds, testing the Airbus's structural limits and challenging my ability to maintain control. I kept a firm but not rigid grip on the controls, allowing the plane to find its own balance amid the atmospheric chaos. Altitude varying between 36,500 and 37,500 feet, Mike reported, monitoring instruments while I focused on keeping the aircraft level. Airspeed oscillating between 260 and 300 knots. The variations were extreme, but still within parameters we could manage. The problem was they seemed to be getting worse every minute. Suddenly, lightning struck the aircraft with a blinding flash and a boom that seemed to go through my bones. The cockpit lit up with blue-white light for a split second, followed by total darkness. Lost the external lights, Mike noted, checking circuit breakers. I'll try to reset. Don't worry about external lights right now. Focus on the flight instruments. But that was easier said than done. Turbulence had intensified to the point where it was difficult to read the instruments, which shook constantly before our eyes. The altimeter spun like a clock hand gone wild, the airspeed indicator oscillated violently, and the artificial horizon struggled to maintain a stable reference amid the chaos. That's when the unthinkable happened. A series of alarms began sounding simultaneously in the cockpit, creating a cacophonous chorus of electronic warnings. I quickly glanced at the alarm panel and felt my heart race. Multiple systems were indicating failure. Mike, what's happening? Captain, I'm seeing navigation system failures. Primary GPS is offline, ILS is intermittent, and VOR has a weak signal. This was much worse than any turbulence. Flying through a severe storm was challenging enough, but losing navigation systems over the Louisiana wetlands, one of the most remote regions in the country, transformed our situation from complicated to potentially catastrophic. "Try restarting the GPS," I instructed, keeping my voice calm despite the panic beginning to grow in my chest. "I'll try to contact control." I grabbed the mic, but when I pressed the button, I heard only static. "Houston Center, American 3847, how do you read?" Just more static. "Mike, try the backup radio." He switched to the secondary communication system and tried contacting control, but the result was the same, only electronic noise. We were completely isolated, flying blind through a Gulf Coast storm, without navigation and without communication. "Captain," Mike's voice was tense but controlled, "the transponder's also offline. They can't track us." The situation had become critical in minutes. We were flying over one of the most remote regions in the country, without navigation, without communication, and with no way to orient ourselves beyond the basic flight instruments that still worked. To make matters worse, we had limited fuel and a storm that seemed endless. I forced myself to breathe deeply and analyze the situation calmly. Years of training and experience had prepared me for emergency situations, but I'd never faced such a dangerous combination of adverse factors. I needed to make quick, precise decisions, because every minute that passed took us deeper into the wetlands, farther from any possibility of emergency landing. "Mike, what's our estimated position based on the last navigation fix?" Last known position was over the New Orleans VOR, approximately 20 minutes ago. Based on average speed and heading, I estimate we're somewhere over south-central Louisiana. South-central Louisiana. A region of dense swampland, with very few cities, and no airport capable of handling an Airbus A320 for hundreds of nautical miles. If we couldn't re-establish navigation and communication quickly, we'd be flying completely lost over one of the most isolated areas on the continent. The storm continued relentlessly. Lightning struck around us with terrifying frequency, each bolt briefly illuminating the massive cloud towers surrounding us. Rain had turned to hail, small ice projectiles hammering the windscreen and wings with enough force to cause structural damage. The noise was deafening, like being inside a giant drum being attacked by 1,000 hammers. "Captain," Mike pointed to the weather radar, which still functioned. "Looks like there's a lower intensity area about 10 miles to our right." I looked at the screen and saw what he'd identified, a yellow region amid the sea of red and magenta surrounding us. It was our best chance to find calmer conditions to assess our systems and try to re-establish navigation. "Let's head there. Heading 090. I initiated a gentle right turn, fighting wind gusts trying to push the aircraft in all directions. Turbulence during the turn was brutal. We experienced negative G forces that pressed us against our seatbelts, immediately followed by positive accelerations that pushed us back into our seats. While navigating toward the lower intensity area, I took the opportunity to assess passenger status. I picked up the PA and made an announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We're going through some turbulence that's more severe than expected, but the aircraft is responding normally. Please keep those seatbelts tight and follow crew instructions. We'll be in calmer conditions shortly." It was a white lie. I didn't know when we'd find calmer conditions or even if we would. But part of a captain's job is maintaining passenger calm and confidence, even when the situation is far from under control. Sarah appeared at the cockpit door again, this time with a scratch on her forehead and wrinkled uniform. "Captain, some passengers are getting pretty nervous. One lady fainted and we've got 2 kids crying pretty hard. How much longer is this going to last?" The question I couldn't answer. "Sarah, do your best to keep everyone calm. We're working to get out of this area as quickly as possible." "Roger, Captain." She left again and I could hear the challenge in her voice. Sarah was an experienced professional, but even she was clearly concerned about the severity of the situation. After what seemed like hours, but was probably only 10 minutes, we began emerging from the most intense part of the storm. Turbulence decreased from severe to moderate. Rain became less intense and, most importantly, we got some visibility through the clouds. "Mike, now that we've got some calm, let's work on the systems. First priority is re-establishing navigation." "I'll try reinitializing all navigation systems," he responded, already working the controls. The emergency manual recommends a complete restart of the flight computers in case of multiple system failure. It was a risky procedure. Shutting down and restarting the main computers during flight always involved the risk of not being able to reinitialize them properly. But without navigation, we were flying blind, and that was even more dangerous. Do it. I'll maintain the aircraft. Mike began the shutdown and reinitialization sequence for the navigation systems. For the next 5 minutes, I flew with minimal instruments, just the backup mechanical artificial horizon, basic altimeter, and airspeed indicator. It was like going back to aviation's early days, depending only on senses and experience to maintain level flight. System reinitializing, Mike reported. GPS coming back online, ILS still intermittent, VOR picking up weak but stable signal. It was progress, but we were still far from having reliable navigation. The GPS showed our position, but I wasn't sure of its accuracy after the period without signal. According to the screen, we were approximately 100 nautical miles southeast of New Orleans, flying over dense swampland without any visual reference. Try contacting any air traffic control, I instructed, anyone who can hear us. Mike began trying different frequencies, calling Houston, New Orleans, and Jacksonville centers. For a few minutes, we received only static, but finally, a human voice emerged through the noise. Aircraft calling New Orleans approach, identify yourself. New Orleans approach, this is American 3847, Airbus A320, 180 souls on board. We had navigation and communication system failure due severe weather conditions. Request guidance to proceed to Miami. American 3847, New Orleans approach, copy. We lost contact with you approximately 40 minutes ago. What's your current position? I consulted the GPS, which still showed intermittent information. New Orleans approach, GPS indicates approximate position 100 miles southeast of New Orleans, FL 370, heading 070. There was a long pause in communication. Finally, American 3847, the route to Miami is completely blocked by severe convective formation. We suggest diversion to New Orleans to wait for better conditions. New Orleans. It was an option, but checking our fuel, I calculated we were at the limit to get there, especially considering the deviations we'd have to make to avoid more storms. And there was another problem. I wasn't completely familiar with New Orleans operations for nighttime A320 approaches, especially in adverse weather conditions. Mike, what's our fuel situation? He consulted the instruments. Captain, we have approximately 3,000 pounds of fuel remaining. With current consumption, that gives us about an hour of flight time. 1 hour. It was little, very little, for the limited options we had. I needed to make a quick decision, and it could mean the difference between arriving safely or facing an even more critical situation. New Orleans approach, American 3847. What's the current weather situation in New Orleans? American 3847, New Orleans reports heavy rain, wind 280 degrees at 25 knots, gusting to 35, visibility 2,000 meters. Conditions are deteriorating. Not good news. Landing in New Orleans under those conditions would be extremely challenging, especially after such an exhausting experience. But the alternatives were even worse. Trying to continue to Miami through more storms with limited fuel, or looking for an even more distant airport. At that moment, the situation became even more complicated. A new set of alarms began sounding in the cockpit, and this time they were engine-related. Captain, we're losing oil pressure on engine 2, Mike reported, his voice tense. Temperatures also rising. I looked at the right engine instruments and confirmed what he'd observed. Oil pressure was in the yellow zone and falling slowly, while temperature was rising steadily. It wasn't a complete failure yet, but it was a clear indication something was wrong. Probably hail damage, I muttered, more to myself than to Mike. Let's reduce power on engine 2 and monitor closely. I carefully reduced power on the right engine, compensating with the left to maintain our speed and altitude. The A320 was designed to fly on one engine if necessary, but I preferred not to test that capability over the Louisiana wetlands in the middle of the night. New Orleans approach, American 3847. We have indication of problem with right engine. We're declaring an emergency and requesting priority to New Orleans. American 3847. New Orleans approach, emergency noted. You have full priority. Direct routing. New Orleans. Descend when ready. Fire trucks and ambulances on alert. Finally, some good news. With full priority, we could fly directly to New Orleans without worrying about other traffic or route restrictions. Mike worked on navigation calculations while I monitored the problematic engine. Captain, direct course to New Orleans is 285 degrees, distance approximately 80 nautical miles. At our current speed, we'll arrive in about 25 minutes. 25 minutes. We had sufficient fuel and the engine was still running, though clearly with problems. It was our best and perhaps only option. I turned to the new heading and initiated a gradual descent. As we lost altitude, weather conditions began improving slightly. There were still thick clouds and occasional rain, but nothing compared to the hellish storm we'd traversed. Mike, contact Sarah and tell her to prepare the cabin for an emergency landing. Nothing dramatic, just standard precautions. Copy, Captain. While he spoke with the purser, I took the opportunity to make an announcement to passengers. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. Due to weather conditions, we're going to make an unscheduled landing in New Orleans. As a precautionary measure, we ask that you follow all crew instructions for landing. The situation is under control and will arrive in approximately 20 minutes. Another white lie. The situation wasn't exactly under control. We had an engine with problems, limited fuel, and bad weather at our destination. But there was no point in unnecessarily alarming the passengers. Sarah came to the cockpit a few minutes later. Captain, cabin's prepared. How's the situation, really? It was a direct question that deserved an honest answer. Sarah, we're going to land with one engine partially functioning and less than ideal weather conditions. I don't expect major problems, but I want you guys ready for a possible rapid evacuation after landing. Understood, Captain. Crew's ready. The next 15 minutes were a mixture of tension and gradual relief. Tension came from constantly monitoring the problematic engine and concern about landing conditions in New Orleans. Relief came from finally approaching an airport, leaving behind the storm and the dangerous vastness of the Louisiana wetlands. New Orleans Tower, American 3847, 10 miles final for approach, requesting runway information. American 3847, New Orleans Tower, wind 290 degrees at 22 knots gusting to 30, moderate rain, visibility 3,000 meters, runway 10 available, length 2,100 meters, fire equipment in position. Runway 10, that meant we'd be landing practically into the wind, which was good. The 2,100 meter length was sufficient for the A320, even with adverse conditions. And most importantly, emergency services were ready. New Orleans Tower, American 3847, configuring for approach runway 10. I initiated approach procedures, lowering the landing gear and extending flaps. The problematic engine continued functioning, but the indications weren't encouraging. Oil pressure had dropped even further, and temperature continued rising slowly. Mike, if engine 2 fails during approach, are we ready for a single-engine landing? Yes, Captain. Speeds calculated, procedures reviewed. We can do this. The final approach was one of the most challenging of my career. Heavy rain limited visibility. Wind gusts constantly rocked the aircraft, and I had to compensate for reduced power from the right engine. But years of training kicked in automatically, and I managed to keep the plane on the approach path. New Orleans runway appeared through the rain when we were only 200 feet above ground. A strip of wet asphalt illuminated by approach lights that looked like the most beautiful thing in the world at that moment. Runway in sight, I announced. Landing configuration confirmed, Mike responded. I touched down smoothly, considering the conditions. The Airbus responded well to controls during rollout, and I managed to keep the aircraft on centerline despite the crosswind. I applied brakes gradually without rushing. We had sufficient runway, and no need to force an overly rapid stop. American 3847, welcome to New Orleans. Exit first taxiway and contact ground on 121.7. First taxiway, ground 121.7, American 3847. Thank you very much, Tower. I exited the runway and stopped the aircraft in the area designated by the fire department. Only then did I realize I was shaking, not from cold, but from the release of all the tension accumulated over the past 2 hours. Mike, shut down the engines, we made it. Engines shut down, Captain. Outstanding job. Over the next few minutes, we performed post-flight procedures while emergency services checked the aircraft externally. Sarah appeared in the cockpit with a relieved smile. Captain, all passengers are fine. Some scared, but all fine. Airport folks are arranging overnight accommodations. Great work, Sarah. The entire crew was outstanding. When I finally shut down the last systems and left the cockpit, I was greeted by spontaneous applause from the passengers. It wasn't something that happened frequently, but at that moment, after everything we'd been through together, it was deeply moving. An elderly lady approached me at the aircraft exit. Captain, thank you so much for bringing us home safe. I've seen storms on TV, but never imagined what it would be like to fly through one. My pleasure, ma'am. Sorry for the rough ride. Rough rides are part of life, Captain. What matters is having competent people taking care of us when they come. We spent that night in New Orleans while technicians examined the aircraft. As I suspected, Engine 2 had suffered hail damage. Some turbine blades were chipped, and there were impact signs on the nacelle. Not catastrophic damage, but sufficient to cause the problems we observed during flight. The storm we encountered was later classified as one of the most severe ever recorded over the Gulf Coast region that year. Winds exceeding 100 knots at altitude, ping-pong ball-sized hail, and electrical activity so intense it interfered with multiple electronic systems of various aircraft in the region. The next day, a replacement aircraft was sent to pick up the passengers, and they arrived in Miami only 12 hours delayed. Our A320 was repaired in New Orleans and flew back to Dallas a week later, completely restored. But for me, that night over the Louisiana wetlands marked something much deeper than just another challenging flight. It was a powerful reminder that no matter how much experience we accumulate or how advanced our technology becomes, nature can still humble us and test us in ways we never imagined possible. I learned that a pilot's true competence isn't measured only by the ability to fly in normal conditions, but by the skill to make correct decisions when everything's going wrong simultaneously. When systems fail, when weather is unpredictable, and when all options are bad, that's when years of training and experience really make the difference. Mike became an even better pilot after that experience. He learned firsthand what no simulator can completely teach: how to maintain calm and focus when the situation seems to be spiraling out of control. Today, many years later, he's a captain with his own stories to tell. Sarah continued flying until she retired a few years ago. Whenever we'd run into each other in company hallways, she'd remind me of that night when we flew through hell and came back to tell about it. She was right, that's exactly what we did. Modern commercial aviation is extremely safe, safer than driving a car or taking a shower. But occasionally, very occasionally, nature reminds us that flying is still an activity that challenges the fundamental laws of physics. We borrow space that belongs to the elements, and sometimes they collect the rent. That night over the Louisiana wetlands taught me that fear isn't necessarily bad. It can be a wise counselor when used properly. Fear kept me alert, made me make conservative decisions, and constantly reminded me of the responsibility I carried. 180 people trusted their lives to my experience and judgment, and that responsibility must be taken seriously on every flight, whether routine or extraordinary. I also learned that communication is fundamental in crisis situations. Keeping passengers informed, coordinating with the crew, and working as a team with the first officer were essential elements for the operation's success. Nobody solves complex problems alone. It's always a team effort. But perhaps the most important lesson was about humility. No matter how many flight hours you have or how many recurrent training courses you complete, there's always something new to learn. Nature has a way of presenting us with situations that aren't in any manual, and it's in those moments we discover what we're really made of. Today, when I fly over the Louisiana wetlands on clear, calm nights, I sometimes look down and remember that Tuesday in March when the swampland was hidden under one of the fiercest storms I'd ever faced. I remember the sound of hail hitting the windscreen, alarms ringing simultaneously in the cockpit, and the feeling of being truly alone with 180 lives depending on my decisions. But mostly I remember the feeling of relief and accomplishment when I touched down in New Orleans. In that moment, I understood why I chose to be a pilot. It's not for the smooth flights on sunny days. Anyone can do that. It's for the moments when we're tested to our limits, when we need to use all our experience, training, and instinct to bring everyone home safe. Aviation is a profession that attracts people who like challenges, but it also teaches us to respect them. Every flight is a small adventure, a chance to see the world from a unique perspective, and an opportunity to connect people across distances. But occasionally, those flights transform into something more. They become tests of character, proofs of competence, and reminders of the responsibility we carry. That night over the Louisiana wetlands, I discovered I was up to the challenge. Not because I'm special or particularly brave, but because years of preparation gave me the tools necessary to face the unexpected. And in the end, that's all any pilot can do. Prepare as best as possible and trust that when the moment comes, they'll know how to make the right decisions. Flying is an activity that combines science and art, technology and intuition, procedures and creativity. It's a profession that demands technical precision but also human judgment. And sometimes, on stormy nights over remote wetlands, those skills are tested in ways we never imagined possible. Every pilot has their that night story, the flight that marked them, that tested them beyond limits, and made them grow professionally. For me, it was American Flight 3847, a Tuesday in March that started as routine and ended as one of the most intense experiences of my career. And the next time you're on an airplane facing turbulence, remember that up front in the cockpit are people who've dedicated their lives to learning how to navigate through whatever challenges the sky can present. People who trained for situations we hope never to encounter, who studied every manual, and who carry the responsibility of bringing you safely to your destination. Because at the end of the day, every safe landing is a small victory against the forces of nature, a testament to humanity's ability to transform impossible dreams into everyday reality. And sometimes, just sometimes, those victories are won in the middle of Gulf Coast storms, with systems failing and fuel running low, when there's no option but to trust in training, experience, and teamwork to find the way home. If you made it this far in this account, you probably understand why we choose to fly despite the risks and challenges. It's because every flight gives us the opportunity to make a difference in people's lives, to connect families, and to make the world a little bit smaller. And occasionally, on nights like that over the Louisiana wetlands, it also gives us the chance to discover what we're really capable of when everything's on the line. Flying through that storm was terrifying, exhausting, and challenging beyond anything I'd experienced before. But it was also deeply rewarding, because in the end, we managed to bring everyone home. And there's no better feeling for a pilot than knowing that 180 people trusted you at the worst possible moment, and you didn't let them down. That's the responsibility and privilege of being a pilot. On good days, we fly through blue skies and do our job naturally. But on difficult days, when storms test our limits and systems fail, that's when we truly justify the trust people place in us. The next time you fly, know that up front, there are people prepared to face whatever challenge might arise. People who transformed the art of flying into science, but never lost sight of the human element that makes it all possible. And if you ever encounter turbulence on your flight, remember that on the other side of it, there's always blue sky waiting. Because that's what we do. We navigate through life's storms to find the calm that's always on the other side. And sometimes, just sometimes, those journeys become stories worth telling. If you enjoyed this story from the skies and want to hear more accounts like this, subscribe to the Black Box channel so you don't miss the next episode. Leave a comment about what situation you'd like to see featured in our upcoming videos. And if you're a pilot or work in aviation, share your own experiences. We all have stories to tell from this fascinating world of flight. Until the next flight, keep those seatbelts fastened and your dreams at cruising altitude.